The case is a ghost. It's been a ghost for decades, haunting the public imagination. JonBenét Ramsey, a 6-year-old girl found dead in the basement of her own home on Christmas night. The story is a tangle of bizarre details. A rambling ransom note, a broken window, a bowl of pineapple, and a family under a cloud of suspicion that has never fully lifted. For years, people have asked the same question. What could solve it? What single thing could cut through all the noise, the theories, the accusations? What could finally point a finger and say, this is the person? The answer has been there all along. It's been sitting in an evidence locker, a tiny, invisible ghost of its own. It's the DNA. But it's not as simple as that. The DNA, in the JonBenét case, is not a smoking gun. It's more like a coded message that no one has been able to decipher. It has been a source of both hope and confusion. It has exonerated some and implicated no one. It is the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case. And it is the single greatest enigma. The key isn't just the DNA itself, it's what we can do with it now. The technology has changed. The methods have evolved. And applying these new tools to this old evidence is the one path that could lead to a final answer. To understand why this DNA is so critical, you have to go back to the beginning. The day after Christmas, 1996, the Ramsey house in Boulder, Colorado was not a crime scene. It was chaos. When Patsy Ramsey called 911 to report her daughter missing and a ransom note found, the house should have been sealed. It wasn't. Friends and neighbors came over to comfort the family. John and Patsy's pastor was there. As victims' advocates arrived, and so did the police. But the police on the scene made critical errors. They didn't secure the house. People walked around, used the kitchen, touched surfaces. John Ramsey himself, along with a friend, was the one who eventually found his daughter's body in a small, windowless room in the basement. He picked her up and carried her upstairs, disrupting the scene in the most profound way possible. This contamination is the original sin of the investigation. It cast doubt on almost every piece of evidence that followed. Any fingerprint, any fiber, any hair could have come from one of the many people who walked through the house that morning. It created a fog that has never cleared. But through that fog, something specific emerged. It was found during the autopsy. On JonBenét's long johns and in her underwear, lab technicians found a small amount of DNA. It was from a male. And crucially, it did not belong to anyone in the Ramsey family. And it didn't belong to John or to her brother Burke. This was a bombshell. It was dubbed a new male one. In the early days of DNA testing, this was a huge deal. Here was physical proof of a stranger. Someone else was in that house. It was the foundation of the intruder theory, the idea that someone broke in, killed JonBenét, and left the strange ransom note to throw police off the scent. The Ramsey family and their supporters clung to this evidence. It was their proof of innocence. For them, the case was simple. Find the man who matches this DNA, and you've found the killer. The sample was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database that holds profiles of convicted felons. The investigators waited for a hit. A match would mean the case was solved, but no hit ever came. Unknown Male 1 was not in the system. For years, the DNA trail went cold. It was a lead that led nowhere. In 2008, the Boulder District Attorney, Mary Lacey, took a dramatic step. She wrote a public letter to John Ramsey, formally apologizing for the suspicion that had fallen on his family. She stated that new, more sensitive touch DNA testing had confirmed the presence of this unknown male DNA. In her eyes, the Ramseys were victims, not suspects. The DNA had officially cleared them. But many in law enforcement were not convinced. The Boulder Police Department never issued a similar statement. They quietly kept the case open and did not remove the Ramseys from their list of potential suspects. This created a deep division. On one side, you had the DA and the Ramseys who believed the DNA was the key to finding an unknown intruder. On the other, you had seasoned investigators who thought the DNA was a red herring, a distraction from the other evidence that pointed towards the family. So why the disagreement? Why wasn't this DNA evidence the clear-cut proof it seemed to be? The problems are complex. First, there's the nature of the DNA itself. This wasn't DNA from blood or semen, which would strongly suggest a violent struggle or a sexual assault. This was touch DNA. We shed skin cells constantly. We leave our DNA on everything we touch. It's tiny, and it can be transferred easily. Think about it. You shake someone's hand. Then you touch a doorknob. Your DNA is on that doorknob. But so is the DNA of the person you just touched. It's called secondary transfer. This possibility opens up a world of doubt. The DNA on JonBenét's clothing could have gotten there in countless innocent ways. Maybe it came from a factory worker who packaged the clothes. Maybe it came from a store clerk. Maybe it was transferred from another piece of clothing in the laundry. The amount of DNA was minuscule. So small, in fact, that for years, labs could only get a partial profile. Then there's the theory that it might not be from a single person at all. Some experts have suggested the DNA profile might be a composite. It could be a mix of tiny, degraded DNA fragments from several different people. When the lab tries to create a profile from this genetic soup, the software might piece together a new artificial profile that doesn't actually belong to any single human being. It's an artifact of the testing process itself. If this is true, then investigators have been chasing a ghost for more than 2 decades. They're looking for a person who doesn't exist. The location of the DNA is also debated. It was found on the outside waistband of her long johns. This isn't necessarily a location you'd expect to find DNA from an attacker. It could be, but it's not definitive. It doesn't scream assault in the way that other evidence might. These problems, the potential for contamination, the issues with touch DNA, the possibility of it being a composite artifact, are why many investigators refuse to let the DNA clear the family. They saw a mountain of circumstantial evidence pointing inward, a ransom note written on a notepad from inside the house with a pen from inside the house, a staged break-in, a lack of footprints in the snow outside. To them, this strange, unmatchable DNA sample wasn't enough to wipe all of that away. The DNA became a battleground, the central point of a debate that has raged for years. It's intruder theory versus family theory, and the DNA was the weapon both sides used. For a long time, it seemed like this was where the story would end. A dead-end case with a piece of phantom evidence at its core. But then, technology caught up, and it created a new path forward. The single clue that could solve the JonBenét Ramsey case is not just the DNA. It's the application of investigative genetic genealogy to that DNA. This is a technique that caught the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo. For decades, he was a ghost, just like Unknown Male 1. Police had his DNA from multiple crime scenes, but it never matched anyone in the criminal database. So investigators took that DNA profile and uploaded it to a public genealogy website, a site like GeneMatch, where people share their DNA results to find relatives and build family trees. They didn't find the killer. They found his great-great-grandparents. They found his third cousins, his second cousins once removed. They started building a massive family tree using the public DNA matches as anchor points. They used census records, marriage certificates, and obituaries to trace the family lines down through the generations. Eventually, they narrowed it down to a small group of men who were the right age and lived in the right area at the time of the crimes. One of them was Joseph James DeAngelo. Police got a sample of his DNA from his car door and his trash. It was a perfect match. The ghost had a name. This is the process that can be used for Unknown Male 1. The technology exists. The methods are proven. It has solved hundreds of cold cases across the country. It takes that dead-end DNA sample and turns it into a web of potential leads. So the most pressing question in the JonBenét case is no longer, who does the DNA belong to? It's, why hasn't this been done yet? The answer, like everything in this case, is complicated. For a long time, the Boulder Police Department was resistant. They were slow to embrace new technologies. There may have been concerns about the quality and quantity of the original DNA sample. To perform genetic genealogy, you need a fairly robust DNA profile. The sample from the Ramsey case was small and potentially mixed. Early attempts may have failed, or the lab may have been worried about consuming the last of this precious evidence on a technique that wasn't a sure thing. There are also policy and privacy concerns. Using public genealogy databases for law enforcement is a relatively new and sometimes controversial field. It requires specific expertise in navigating a complex set of legal and ethical rules. It's not as simple as just uploading a file. It takes a dedicated team, significant resources, and the will to push forward. For years, it seemed that was lacking, but public pressure and the tireless work of advocates has started to change things. In recent years, the Boulder Police Department has confirmed they are working with outside experts and looking into genetic genealogy. They are being secretive about the details, as they should be in an active investigation. But the door now seems to be open. This is the single ray of light in this long, dark case. It is the one action that could produce a name. A real name. Not a theory, not a suspicion, but a person. What would happen if they did it? What would a match mean? It's not an automatic end to the story. Anyway, let's imagine they run the profile, and they get a hit. They build a family tree and trace it down to a man living in a nearby town. Let's call him John Smith. What happens next? First, police would have to covertly obtain John Smith's DNA to confirm he is a direct match to Unknown Male 1. If he is, the investigation would explode back to life, but it wouldn't be a simple arrest. The defense for John Smith would immediately raise all the old arguments. The DNA is touch. DNA. It could have been transferred innocently. He might have worked at the factory that made the Long Johns. He might have brushed past her in a store. The DNA proves he came into contact with her clothes at some point. It does not, by itself, prove he was in the basement that night. The prosecution would then have to build a case around the DNA. They would have to find a connection, however tenuous, between John Smith and the Ramsey family. Did he ever work for them? Did he live in their neighborhood? Does he have a criminal history of similar crimes? Does his life story have any overlap with the known facts of the case? The DNA would be the starting point, the map that tells investigators where to dig. It would not be the treasure itself. There are other, more complex possibilities. What if the DNA matches someone who was already known to be in the house that day? A friend of the family, a police officer who responded to the scene. That would change the narrative completely. It would suggest that the intruder, DNA wasn't from an intruder at all, but from someone whose presence was supposedly innocent. The investigation would turn in a shocking new direction, and there is the most disappointing possibility. What if they run the profile and it leads them to a factory worker in Asia who assembled the garment? Or what if the lab concludes, once and for all, that the sample is too degraded or is indeed a composite of multiple people? What if the ghost really is just a ghost? That outcome would also be a major development. It would effectively neutralize the single biggest piece of evidence for the intruder theory. It would remove the shield that the Ramsey family has held up for decades. If unknown male 1 does not exist, then the investigation is forced back inside the house. It would force everyone to look again at the original evidence. The ransom note, the family's behavior, the inconsistencies in their stories. Lack of a DNA match could be just as powerful as a match itself. It would close one door permanently, forcing everyone to look at the others that remain. This is why the DNA is the key. It's the fulcrum on which the entire case balances. A successful genetic genealogy investigation would either identify the intruder or demolish the intruder theory for good. Either outcome would be a monumental step towards the truth. It would finally break the stalemate that has paralyzed this case for a generation. The story of JonBenét Ramsey is a tragedy in 2 parts. The first was her death. The second has been the failure to find justice for her. That failure is a product of a contaminated crime scene, a polarized investigation, and a media circus that warped the public's perception of everyone involved. It created a fog of confusion, a web of endlessly debatable theories. The DNA, enhanced by the power of genetic genealogy, is the one thing sharp enough to cut through it all. It is a tool of pure science in a case that has been dominated by emotion and speculation. It can provide a simple factual answer. It can give us a name. That name may belong to a killer who has lived a free life for more than 25 years. It may belong to an innocent person whose DNA was in the wrong place at the wrong time, forcing investigators to look elsewhere. It may even be that there is no name to find, that the DNA is a phantom that has led everyone astray. Whatever the answer, it is an answer we need. The process of finding it is the only clear path forward. It's the one action that could take this case out of the realm of true crime podcasts and television specials and put it back where it belongs, in a courtroom in front of a jury. It is the single clue, the single process, the single hope for a resolution. After all this time, it is the only way to finally let the ghost of this case rest.